Hi, I'm Larry. I born and raised here in Phoenix, lived here my whole life. I have a wife, Rhonda, 3 sons, Trent, Jared, and Cameron, and they are all of them the joy of my life. I have a small financial planning company here in Phoenix, Arizona, and enjoy my work. Also enjoy spending time with kids. Coached baseball for a little over 20 years, and just want to tell you a little bit about my story. And I'm going to start about 15 years ago when I was having some real struggles, serious spiritual struggles. I was scared to death, literally. I was scared of death. I wasn't afraid of hell, just really afraid of nothing, ceasing to exist. It was terrifying, and I'd have panic attacks in the middle of the night, wake up, and literally not be able to sleep for hours. And it was a really, really, really tough time for me, struggling for a couple of years. I dealt with it. And finally, I took the time and called the church and went and visited the elders and just kind of talked to them about the things that I was dealing with. And we prayed and had a peace back in my heart again and in my mind. And as I was walking out the door that evening, from our church, one of the elders stopped me and he said, "Larry, before you leave, can I ask you one question?" He said, "How are things with you and your dad?" And I looked at him and I said, "He's dead, John, and I hope he's burning in hell." Right about that time, John and Randy kind of grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Maybe we're not quite done yet. I think we have a few other things that we need to talk about." Randy Murphy and my good friend Joel Mishler took me through the CTO process, and it was that where a lot of things were revealed. I was raised by a single mom. I have 5 sisters and a brother. And in 1965, my father was shot and killed. And I was only 3 years old at the time. Really, only have 1 or 2 vague memories of my dad. Grew up knowing my dad was a hero and how he died, and went to Korea, got a Purple Heart, and he died a hero here in the United States, right here in Phoenix, protecting a woman from an abusive husband. We had some difficult times growing up, but for the most part, I was a very happy kid, and it was a good childhood. I remember standing up and standing at the batter's box, and I really haven't told a whole lot of people about this, but I picture my dad there watching me. We were out in Chandler, Arizona. It was a Thanksgiving gathering at my Uncle Donald's, and he said something about my dad that it didn't click. I don't know, later that day, I took him aside out and I said, "Donald, what was that you said about my dad? I didn't understand. What was that all about? I don't understand what you were talking about." He looked at me and he said, "Larry, you're old enough now. I think it's time you know the truth about how your father really died." Up till this point, my vision of my dad was a war hero, a protector, a loving father and husband. And then he told me the truth. My dad was caught in an adulterous affair and had an adulterous affair for some time, and he was shot to death and killed by an angry, jealous husband. I didn't even call him my dad anymore. As far as I was concerned, he was the worst person who could have ever been in my life. Even going to the baseball games, going out and going hunting or fishing, or learning how to work on a car, or how to cook a steak, or how to do anything. I didn't have that, and it really angered me. But more than that, what really angered me is what he did to my mom. I remember one day very specifically, I was on the Durango curve, and I was coming around the curve. I was listening to Kansas, the band, "Dust in the Wind." All we are is dust in the wind. Was not a believer at the time, did not have Christ in my life, and that song just hit me. And at that very moment, those panic attacks, they actually started that day when I was 19 years old. And I just literally driving on the highway, my hands were shaking so bad. It was the first time that I had ever really considered the fact that I was going to die. The nights were really, really, really hard. The darkness just kind of engulfed me completely. Going through the process that God took me through CTO Ministries and really understanding who was in control, and it's not me, and it's not you, by the way. God was in control of everything, and He really revealed to me that my dad is just a man. It wasn't, hey, we sit down and we read a couple of Bible verses and pray and everything's great. No, it was a long, long process. God is sovereign, and He took me through that process. And there are still times when I have to even stop and thinking about different things that have happened in my life, and I kind of feel maybe a little sorry for myself or feel a little angry still to this day. Sometimes things come up and I have to take the time to sit down and go back to God's Word and forgive Him. I think the experience that I had with my father was, or without my father, is exactly where God wanted me to go through. And I'm thankful for him, and thankful for my father, thankful for especially my Father in heaven, who's never let me down.
Two things will destroy you from the inside out. One of those is guilt, and the other is bitterness. Bitterness plagued Larry. That bitterness that just plagued him, that produced this incredible panic attacks in his life. Interesting, we had Larry go through our process of forgiving his dad, his dead dad, who he was still harboring bitterness toward. He forgave him and began letting what he knew to be true about God trump how he felt, and began to renew his mind with the truth of who God is. And guess what happened to the panic attacks? They went away. Bitterness and guilt can do all kinds of things to you. We're going to see it in our session after lunch of what guilt did to David when he didn't deal with it. It'll eat you from the inside out. And here's two realities, you guys. People are going to sin against you until the day that they die. If you don't deal with the sin against you, it will turn to bitterness. Here's the other reality. You're going to sin against people until the day that you die. And if you don't deal with that sin, it can turn into guilt. And guilt and bitterness will eat you from the inside out. And not only that, it will destroy all your relationships. Listen to what Hebrews 12:15 says. See to it that no one misses the grace of God or comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up that causes trouble, and by it many are defiled. Okay, you think you can harbor bitterness towards someone over here, but everything else is okay in your life. No, it's not. See, you can't take a little portion of your heart and this section of your heart and say, this part of my heart, I'm going to harden toward that person because of what they did to me. The rest of my heart's going to be okay. It doesn't work that way. You harden your heart and you got a hard heart, and guess what that's going to do? That's going to affect every relationship you have. It's going to affect your relationship to others. It's going to affect your relationship to yourself, and it's going to affect your relationship with God. Ephesians 4 says we're to forgive each other just as God in Christ has forgiven you. So we're to put off. It says, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you. Instead, be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving each other just as God in Christ has forgiven you. We're to put off all of those things in order to put on these things. And the bridge between the putting off all that wrath and clamor and anger and bitterness and vengeance, in order to put on kindness and compassion, I believe the bridge between that is forgiveness. So let me give you a definition of forgiveness. Forgiveness is releasing an offender from your bitterness, wrath, or judgment that they may deserve. Okay, now I want you to underline 2 words. What do you think is the first word I want you to underline? You want to take a shot at it? Releasing. Good. Underline releasing. What's the next word I want you to underline? It's really 2 words together. May deserve. When someone sins against you, they create an obligation. And that obligation is valid. So when someone sins and hurts us and we feel like what we want them to experience is our wrath, it's because that's what they deserve. Now watch this. We're told to forgive as God in Christ has forgiven us, right? Does God give us the wrath we deserve? Do we deserve it? Yeah, I deserve to burn in hell, and anything less than that's a pretty darn good day. But instead of giving us the wrath we deserve, he gives us grace and mercy. So see, when I experience and understand God's forgiveness in my life, instead of giving people the wrath they may deserve, God didn't give me the wrath I deserve. He gave me grace and mercy. So you know what I'm going to give them? I'm going to give them the grace and mercy that God gave me, even though I didn't deserve it. So it's releasing an offender from your wrath, judgment, and bitterness that they may deserve. And some of you in this room have been sinned against in really, really awful, horrible ways. And everything inside of you says, I want them to experience my wrath. But you know what God calls you to? To release them from your bitterness, wrath, and or judgment, even though that may be what they deserve. Wow. Okay, now let's talk for a couple minutes about what forgiveness is not. Because this gets really confused today. Okay, number 1, forgiveness is not based on feelings. Do you know how often I feel like forgiving my wife? I never feel like forgiving her. You know what I want to do? I want to rub her face in what she's done, and I want her to experience my wrath, and I want her to feel really, really bad for what she did to me. I don't want to forgive her. I don't feel like that. If I wait until I feel like forgiving somebody, guess what I'll forgive? Never. Forgiveness is not basically, yeah, but you know what? If I don't feel like it, then I'm just going to be a hypocrite if I forgive them. Okay, let's go down that path. So you're either going to be a hypocrite to what you feel, or you're going to be a hypocrite to the truth of what God's called you to. Either way, you're a hypocrite, so choose your hypocrisy. It's not based on feelings. It's not, I have to feel. No, it's not based on feelings. This is an issue of obedience. This is what God calls you to do. This is the reality of the gospel in your life. It's not based on feelings. Second, it's not minimizing or forgetting it. It's not just saying, you guys, it wasn't that big of a deal. Or maybe it was a really big deal and it hurt a lot. I love in Genesis 50, Joseph, after his brothers sold him into slavery, he gets sent off into Egypt. In Egypt, he gets thrown in prison. And then finally he gets out. And now there's a famine in the land. So his family travels to Egypt to try to get food. They don't know who he is. He does all that stuff with his brother and hiding this stuff in their bag. And then they come back and they bring Jacob back. And he finally reveals to them who he is. And they're scared spitless. Because they know, you know what? You know what we deserve from him? And man, he's the second most powerful person in the country. And he finally says this. He says, guys, first in Genesis 45, he says, you didn't send me here, God sent me here. See, he had the big picture of the story of God. It wasn't the story of Joseph, it was the story of God. And he was part of God's story, and that was part of God's story in his life. God sent me here. Okay, 5 years later now, they've been living there. Jacob dies. And there's, now he's going to get us because he's been nice to us just because Dad was alive. You know, he was Dad's favorite son, gave him that special coat and everything. Now he's going to get us. And here's what he says. Okay, you guys, don't fear. Because what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Now look, he didn't say, guys, it was no big deal. He acknowledged, you had evil in your heart in what you wanted to do. You meant it for evil. And he didn't say, God found some way to make it good. No, God meant it for good. He saw the bigger picture of the story of God in all that had happened through all of his life. It's not minimizing it. It's not forgetting it. But if I forgive, I can't forget. You're not going to forget. It's not placing it on the shelf. This is what we often do. Here's what happens. We get hurt, and what we do is we try to find a way to deal with the hurt and the pain, so we try to get it out of sight, out of mind. And we stick it back here on the shelf, and we think, there, I've forgiven. I have people all the time say, I got nobody to forgive. I got nothing to forgive. Oh, really? Maybe you just stuck it on the shelf. Now, here's what happens. When it's on the shelf, it's back there, still sitting there, and it's going to fall off the shelf in one of two times. One is if there's another event that happens that has similar pain related to it, all of a sudden the pain that's sitting back there on the shelf falls into this. Before I was married, I lived with 3 other guys in Southern California, and you know, guys don't talk about their relationships with each other. We just don't talk about that stuff, right? Well, all of us were starting to get chips on our shoulder about the other guys. One guy felt nobody takes their turn cleaning the swimming pool. Another guy felt nobody takes their turn mowing the lawn. So what he would do is he'd mow the lawn on Saturday morning at 6 a.m. and make sure he mowed right underneath our window. I got together with that old college friend and roommate a couple of years ago, and I brought that up, and he started laughing. He goes, I never mowed the lawn. I just started the lawnmower up and stuck it under your window and just left it sitting there running. Okay. My big thing was nobody's taking their turns with food. So one night, I bought a gallon of milk. I stuck it in the refrigerator. I went to bed. The next morning, I get up to have my ceremonial bowl of cold cereal before I went off to seminary to learn how to be a good pastor, and the whole gallon of milk is gone. I'm livid. I'm mad. Heads are going to roll. This is it. The end of the world is now. Why was that $2 gallon of milk such a big deal? Because all of the resentment that I had, that I wasn't dealing with, that I just put on the shelf, fell off of the shelf and landed right in that gallon of milk. Okay, those of you that are married, when you have one of those moments of intense fellowship with your spouse, a fight, is the presenting thing that happened at that moment really the issue? Seldom, right? It's this pile of other stuff. You know what? It's stuff on the shelf. The second time stuff comes off of that shelf is when I feel like I'm being attacked by you, and I'm going to turn around and I'm going to strategically pull things that I've stuck on the shelf to use as arrows to shoot back at you. That's not forgiveness. Okay? Just because it's out of sight, out of mind, you just found a way in your flesh to try to deal with this. And I'm telling you, it's going to come back to haunt you. It's not the removal of consequences. Well, if I forgive, then they're not going to be held accountable to anything. God forgives us, but he doesn't remove all the consequences. Did God forgive me for all of my drug use in the 70s? Did God forgive me for all the weed I smoked? Yeah. But you know what? My memory isn't as good as it used to be. I don't hardly remember 11th grade. You're my friend. Yeah. Is that consequences? Yeah. I've got friends who have severe consequences from their drug use. Did God forgive them? Yeah, but they didn't remove all the consequences. So you think, if I forgive, there's no consequence. Okay, can't go there. It's not the same as reconciliation. Reconciliation is two people coming together and seeking forgiveness from each other to make the relationship right. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. Forgiveness is not the same as restoring the relationship. If there's been an affair in a relationship, that couple can seek each other's forgiveness and reconcile their relationship, but trust was violated at a major level, and it's going to take time to rebuild and restore trust. You don't just say, well, I forgive them, so I trust them. So that's not forgiveness. Forgiveness is releasing an offender from your bitterness, wrath, and judgment that they deserve. Okay. I asked Jim and Denise to come and help me a minute here. We're going to show you how this works. Okay? And man, am I behind. We're going to show you how this works. So we're going to start with Denise. Okay? So what happens is Denise sins against Jim. Okay, so just set it right down here, right? Let's do it right over here, right there. That's good. That'll give you enough room. Okay, so you know what Denise does? She tries to become convincing. She's going to convince Jim. You know why? Because guess who the problem is? Jim. Okay? So how does Jim respond? What does Jim do? Jim says, well, I know how to resolve this. I've got a remedy to this. I'm going to keep Denise happy. I'm going to become a people pleaser. You know what the problem is? Here's what Denise thinks is going to take to make her happy. And guess what? Jim gets to about right here, and what happens? Now it's going to take that to keep her happy. So you know what Jim does? Look at how Jim responds to that. Next one, Jim. So Jim starts withdrawing. Guess what Denise does? He withdraws. You know what she does? She starts attacking him for that. So Jim responds back and says, well, that's not good. And what Jim then does is he tries to avoid this conflict. Well, guess how Denise responds to that? She says, well, I can deal with this. I'll just create more conflict. And then Denise says, okay, now this conflict is gone. The next thing Denise does is she starts getting really, really judgmental of Jim. And Jim goes, oh, this is not good. So Jim says, you know what? It's not that big of a deal. It just really is not that big of a deal. So he minimizes all of this. Okay, so Denise, what do you do next? She gets more critical of Jim, then what do? You get more critical of him. Denise, go ahead. And the next one. So she tries to intimidate him, and you know what Jim does? Jim comes and joins me over in that river land of denial. Yep, you're good. Next. What do you do next, Jim? That's it, right on top. So he says, I can't deal with this anymore. I got to find some way of escape. And he goes, well, this isn't working so well, so you know what I'm going to have to do? I just have to withdraw from relationship, and I have to isolate myself. The escapes aren't working. And he either then sees himself as a victim or a martyr. And guess what Denise sees herself as? She sees herself as a victim and a martyr. And so you know where that takes Denise? To her last block, she gets really, really demanding. And Jim, what's he do? That's it, Jim. Nope, that's not it. That's it. What does he do? He starts fantasizing and trying to find an escape. Now, Jim, put the last one on the top of the middle of both blocks, because here's where they both land. They blame each other for all of this. They blame each other for all of this. Now, what we have here is a double-sided brick wall. When I have Tom and Sue in my office after about 8 years of marriage, and Sue is sitting on the couch facing this way with her arms folded, and Tom is over here sitting on the couch facing this way with his arms folded, and here's what they tell me. We don't love each other anymore. We don't love each other anymore. And Sue says, as a matter of fact, I had doubts walking down the aisle, but it was too late. Do you know how often I hear that? I hear that all the time. I had doubts walking down the aisle, but it was too late. We don't love each other anymore. We married the wrong person. Here's what they're telling me. Here's what they're telling me. There's a double-sided brick wall that over the years we have built between the two of us. I've tried to get around it, but it's too wide. I've tried to get over it, but it's too high. I've been trying to crash through this brick wall, and I'm banging my head against these blocks, this brick wall, and my head hurts. I can't do this anymore. Some of you this morning walked into this room and your head hurts. And you walked in and said, I can't do this anymore. What do we do with this brick wall? We're going to take a 15-minute break and come back and I'll tell you exactly what we're going to do with this brick wall. Grab yourself some coffee, some refreshments, and we'll start in 15 minutes.